We're continuing on with finding out who Peter is before we get into the book of Peter. And so this week we're doing Peter the Disciple WC. That doesn't make sense unless you were here last week and saw that last week was Peter the Man BC, or before Christ. And so now Peter the Disciple is with Christ. Okay? On the high points that we touched last week for Peter the Man, what we found out is that he was married because he had a mother-in-law, and nobody wants a mother-in-law unless you're married. You may not even want them then. He was a fisherman by trade, not by hobby. We talked about that. And then I missaid this both times last week, so if you didn't see the slide, you're probably wondering why was I saying ready, aim, fire. Peter was the type to be ready, fire, aim type person. So I said it wrong. I looked at the sermon, I said it wrong all the time. So he was that quick, act before he thought about it sometimes. And we're going to see that today. And then he was not always a rock. And that was the key drive behind this message last week, was that he was given a title in John 1:42 where Jesus says, now you'll be called Cephas, or Petrus, which is rock. And then he got the call to follow as a disciple. And then the title was reaffirmed that he was a rock later on in Christ's ministry. And the point to this was, Christ knows who we are now, who we were yesterday, and who we will be, and that he knows who we are before we even decide to start following him, much like with Peter. Okay? And so before we get into today's passage, I want to give a little bit of discourse, if that's a fancy enough word for it, on the gospel details, peripheral gospel details. And I want to talk about each of the four Gospels briefly. First off, Matthew is known as one of the synoptic Gospels because it's very similar in nature of two other Gospels. Okay? And Matthew, who was Matthew? Matthew was considered to be the seventh or eighth disciple called. So he was not one of the first group, or he wasn't one of the inner circle of three that we'll talk about later. And then the gospel, the focus of his gospel is on the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies, okay? He was very much writing to a Jewish audience. And this will all make sense as we move along on the sermon and why you need to know this information, okay? Then we have John. John was not one of the synoptic gospels. He was one of the first four disciples called. He was Peter's partner. Remember we saw that last week, that he was in the other boat. He called his partners from the other boat, were James and John. And so they knew each other even before they started following Christ. And that's why sometimes you might see references to John's writing about how he beat Peter to the tomb. How he was running faster than Peter, okay? And so there is, I think, a little bit of this competition maybe, or a little bit, you see the dynamic of their relationship a little bit when you recognize who wrote what gospel, okay? And continuing on, his gospel focus, because he wrote his last, okay? He wrote his later in life, and so the first three guys basically got the life of Jesus, and so John was able to focus on the deity of Jesus and the eternal life that we have available for those who believe in him. Okay, and then Luke is a synoptic gospel, and I'm purposely doing these out of order, and you'll see why here in a moment. Okay, is that he was not a disciple, and he was most likely the only Gentile biblical author. Okay, he was the only author of a book in the Bible, or at least in the New Testament, and he was a Gentile, not a Jew. Okay, he was a physician, but he was more of a historian, and the details that he wrote his gospel on were gathered by interviewing witnesses. Okay, he went and got first eyewitness accounts of who Jesus was, and that's how he assembled his gospel. His focus on his gospel is the inclusion of the Gentiles in salvation. In fact, the parable of the Good Samaritan is only found in Luke's gospel. So he was very much focused, and when, if you look in the birth of Christ, he quotes the Old Testament where it talks about the nations, the Gentiles, that he's been called as a light to the Gentiles. So it's really focused on not just a Jewish audience. And now we get to Mark. And the reason why I saved Mark for last is because he was not a disciple, but he was Peter's son, most likely in the faith, because we know who his mother was, and so Peter was not his father. So when Peter says his son in the book of 1 Peter at its closing, he's saying that he's most likely the one responsible for leading him to Christ, or something along that line, okay? So very close relationship with Peter. There's also familial connections to Mary, the Mary in Acts, not the Gospels, and Barnabas. And there's a little bit of dynamic that plays out there. Mary was Mark's mother, okay? And then Barnabas was Mary's brother. And you actually see that Mark was both Barnabas's nephew and cousin, okay? And that kind of threw my head for a spin. But if his dad was a cousin to Barnabas and his mom was his sister, then that works. Okay? There's a whole dynamic if you look into the language and the Greek and this, that, and the other about how both of those statements are true, that he was the son of Mary in the book of Acts, and Mary was a key player in the book of Acts. In fact, when Peter was in prison and they were all praying for him, they were praying for him in Mary's house. Okay, and the angel came and set him free, and he went back, and that's the whole story in the early Acts where he's knocking on the door, and this maiden comes down who's in Mary's house, and Peter says, "Let me in," and she runs back in the house without letting him in, because it's like he's supposed to be in prison. Okay, that's another aspect of Peter might get to in the book of Acts, okay? But Mark was very close with Peter, okay? And so his account of the gospel is most likely Peter's viewpoint. So in some regards, you could say the gospel of Mark is the gospel of Peter. Okay? And that's keys in on our message today a little bit, because believe it or not, we're not going to read this account of Jesus walking on the water from Mark's gospel. We're going to read it because it's only found. This aspect of it is only found in Matthew's gospel, okay? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's go ahead and read the primary passage. We're in Matthew, and we're in chapter 14, and we're going to read verses 22 through 33. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, Christ, went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Okay, before we dive into that, before diving into that passage a little bit deeper, I want to give some more background to what's going on, okay? We'll see that in the verses is that the sea, so far, what has happened in the recent past of this event, okay, is that Jesus has already stilled the sea. Legion, the demon that when he cast out Legion into Jesus did into the herd of pigs, Legion was his name because when Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" he said, "We are Legion because we are many." Okay, so that has recently happened. Okay, Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood were both healed. Okay, and then Peter, in that section, Peter is shown for the first time as one of the inner circle. You often will hear about the inner circle. That's Peter, James, and John. And in that passage that Jesus only allowed Peter, James, and John to go with him to Jairus' house after the woman with the issue of blood was healed, okay? I had to find a way to get you guys up to speed on this without actually preaching every one of these and reading every one of these, okay? So, the next thing is that the 12 were sent out to serve and return. Jesus gave them the power to heal the sick and to cast out demons in his name. Jesus sent them out to do this, okay? And they came back. In the between time, between them being sent out and before they got back, we get the news of the beheading of John the Baptist. And then finally, 5,000 men are fed, not counting the women and children, okay? And this is the key, because the 12 that were sent out, they got sent out, they came back, and Jesus was taking them away to go and rest, to take a break, to have a mini vacation, okay? But the multitudes followed them, okay? And after Jesus had compassion on them and talked with them and healed them, then it's like they couldn't be sent away because they were out in the wilderness, and so that's where Jesus fed the 5,000. Right after the 12 went out to do all this amazing stuff, they came back. They were tired, and Jesus was going to take them on a break, and then they get followed by all the multitudes, okay? So now let's jump back into the story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water. So immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, okay? Now, before we talk about the other side, I thought it might be interesting to kind of give you a geographical location of where they are so we know what the other side is. We do if we read further in the gospel. But what's been going on in these things that we did is that this right here is a bird's eye view, a very high up bird, I guess, of Israel, okay? And the main thing I want to point out here is that body of water down at the bottom, that's the Dead Sea. And that body, little one up at the top, is the Sea of Galilee. We mentioned that last week. It's also known as Lake Gennesaret or Lake Tiberias. And so that's the Sea of Galilee, and that's where our focus is on this passage today. Okay, so if we zoom in on this, you can't see those titles, but up there in the upper right is Bethsaida, okay? And on the left is Gennesaret. They were heading to Gennesaret because you see that in the following chapter of our passage we're reading, okay? And so Bethsaida is up there in the area they most likely came from. And so he sent the multitudes away. And then if we continue, so here we see the most likely spot for the feeding of the 10,000. They did some theorizing. I'm not going to guarantee this information. But they have a good idea that it was most likely because they were in the wilderness outside Bethsaida when Jesus fed the 5,000. So they kind of think this would be a good place to say that's where Jesus was. Okay? And he sent the multitudes away after he fed them. And then when he had sent the multitudes away, so again, you're pointing out that there was a lot of people here. At least, 5,000 men, and they say anywhere upwards of 15 to 20,000 people total when you count the women and children. Okay, so he sent the multitudes away, and he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And again, here's that picture back, and that's where they think why this is a good spot to say this is where it occurred, because there's that little, I know we wouldn't call that a mountain here, okay? But that was most likely, I just think it's cool to see something like to think that Jesus prayed right there. Quite possibly Jesus went there and prayed after doing some amazing things. So we see all these amazing things that happened in the short term, in the recent past for where we're at now, because we're going to talk about that or point that out as we go through this message today. And so when evening came, he was alone there. So it's nighttime. Okay, and what was going on? Meanwhile, back at the boat, right? But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Okay? Contrary to what? It was just contrary. And I kind of like, because I wanted to be like, well, contrary means it's contrary to something. And not necessarily. This Greek word gives us an impression of it's just contrary, it's just against. It's just against, okay? It doesn't matter if you're on this side, it's against you. And if you're on this side, it's against you. So that's what he's saying about this wind. It was just, no matter what you did, it was against you, okay? You could not get with the wind. The wind just didn't want you to be with it, okay? And they're being tossed by waves. And then we come into it, it says, now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. Okay, the fourth watch of the night. When is the fourth watch of the night? Well, the Romans had 4 watches every night, so this is the last watch. The first watch of the night is 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., and then 9 to midnight was the second watch, and then midnight to 3 a.m. was the third watch. So the fourth watch is between 3 and 6 a.m. And if you want an idea of how miserable you can be at 3 to 6 a.m., when I was in the Army, we had to do something that was called stand to when we were out in the field. So I was in the Army for 7.5 years, and when I was and of that time, I had at least 365 days out in the field. Okay, so we spent some time out in the field. And so they had you at about 5 or 5:30, you had to get up, you had to put all your stuff on and take your weapon and go out to your fighting position that was on the peripheral of where your unit was at. Okay, and what did we do there? We stand to. Okay, we stayed there and waited because that's the most likely time the enemy is going to attack, is at dawn. Okay, out of all that time and 365 days out in the field playing war, we never got attacked. Okay, just saying. So we had to go to stand to, and nothing ever happened. Okay, we just lost sleep. Okay, so that was really late. Jesus had been up all night praying, and then he takes a walk across the Sea of Galilee, and we see Jesus then went to them walking on the sea. Okay. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, right? They were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. How many times when we need Jesus to do something in our lives, we're scared of something, we're afraid of something, and so we are looking to Christ, and they're seeing Christ, and then I'm getting ahead of my notes, sorry. So, but immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Be of good cheer," he says. He spoke to them and said, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And what's kind of cool is this good cheer is not, I used to think of this when I see this in the Bible, this good cheer or be of courage. It's like pick yourself up by your bootstraps and face life, okay? But believe it or not, this is not what Jesus says when he says be of good cheer or be of courage. He's saying this voice summons an inward confidence that rests on an external source. So you're not picking yourself up by your bootstraps. When you're saying, when you're getting an inward confidence, it's because of an external force, God's saving presence. The verb never depicts self-generated optimism. It always arises from a word or act of the Lord that decisively removes the cause of fear. So when you say, I used to be the one, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. No. Get Christ to pick you up by your bootstraps, okay? That inward confidence that God is going to be with you and God is going to come through no matter what storm you might be in, okay? And what's also cool about this is you hear, maybe you haven't, but there's this idea in the book of John of these I am statements from Jesus that basically is very clear saying he is Yahweh. I am is Yahweh. Okay, that's what comes from the Old Testament and moves on. Egoini is the Greek word. It is I am. Well, this is essentially what Jesus is saying in the book of Matthew. If you look at a little bit more literal interpretation of this passage, it says, "Be of good cheer," because the very external source of your strength and your courage is I am, is God, is him. He says, do not be afraid. So don't be afraid. God is with you. I am here. So be of good courage. Okay, and then we see, right on top of it, Peter, right? Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Look at that. Lord, if. Isn't it this used to always mess with my brain because I'm a logical person. I'm kind of like, if I was Peter, I would not ask the apparition that I'm seeing to come to him, right? So what we see here is this interplay within Peter that wants to have the faith. He wants to believe, but yet part of him still does not want to believe, right? Because he's afraid of this ghost, but he's asking the ghost to command him. Right? So it's counterintuitive to what's going on. Okay? And it says, command me to come to you on the water. And so what happens? Then Jesus said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Now, a lot of people or a lot of theologians, they kind of like to stretch out the timeline, in my opinion, because they want to talk about the physics of Jesus walking on the water, the storm, how close was Jesus to the boat. Peter was really wanting to show off. All these, they do this, but I'm telling you, when you're in the heat of the moment, okay, I got another fishing story. I got to go fishing this past week, and I caught another one. It took me about 5 or 6 minutes to get that fish in. It was really cool. This is the longest I've ever had to fight a fish, okay? Nothing spiritual was going through my mind in that 5 minutes, right? I was really focused on bringing that fish in and just thinking about, I don't want to lose this fish. I don't want to lose this. This is cool. And so this whole idea that Peter's got an ulterior motive on wanting to go out and walking on the water, I think is a bunch of gibberish, okay? And I'll tell the theologians that to their face if they want to argue with me, okay? Because it's not about how deep he was thinking. It was about him like, that's Jesus. I want to go see Jesus. He's walking on the water. It's cool. You know, it's like more of an instant reaction than okay, Jesus, I'm going to show how important I am. Because the other reason why I don't think there's anything deeper to it than this is because they've already been sent out. The 12 have been sent out to heal the sick, to cast out demons in Christ's name, and they've already come back. So why does Peter have to anymore prove that he's all that in a bag of chips, that it's about him? He already knows it's about Christ. And so when Peter, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But then what happens? What happens when we got our eyes on Jesus, we got our mark, we got our mission, we're moving forward? What happens to us a lot of times, right? When he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. Okay? When the wind was boisterous, this is a strong equivalent to violence. So when he saw how violent the wind was, so how often do we, when we're moving forward in life, doing Christ's mission, we think and everything, and all of a sudden we start looking around, take our eyes off Jesus and start looking around, it's like, whoa, we're in a heap of trouble here. When you're not. Right? Peter was not in a heap of trouble until he took his eyes off Jesus. And same thing of what he did is what we do. We get afraid, we begin to sink, and what do we do, or what should we do? We cry out to Jesus, we cry out to the Lord, Lord, save me. And what happens? Right? And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, right? Immediately. Here's the thing, Mark really used, the book of Mark, even though this isn't Mark, uses the word immediately quite frequently. He's the one that uses it the most, meaning it's just this spur of the moment call to action, immediately. Okay, so we often think, okay, I'm in trouble, I cried out to you, Jesus, and you're not immediately, right? You're not being immediate. Why aren't you being immediate? Because we're not sinking yet, okay? We're focused on Christ, we're doing Christ, so we need to remember sometimes Christ is not immediately eating because it's not time for him to be immediately eating, right? I love being able to make up words up here, okay? All right, and so what did Jesus tell him though? He says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Remember, that's the thing. I get what Jesus is saying to Peter because we already talked about all the things he's seen, right? They just fed 5,000 the day before, right? Less than 24 hours. This is 3 to 5 in the morning, right? And it was just yesterday that Jesus fed the 5,000 from, I don't remember if that one was the 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, or if that's the next one because he did it twice. Okay, is that he just saw that. And then he's thinking, I think that's Jesus. I'm going to ask the ghost to tell me to come out to him. And then I go and it's working. And then I take my eyes off Jesus and I start sinking. So Jesus is like, Peter, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? You know that I'm here for you. You know I'm going to take care of you. You know that I'm here. And so Jesus, yes, is scolding him a little bit, saying, why did you doubt? Why do you have so little faith? It almost makes me think, especially after what you've just been doing. So we don't always get to see 5,000 people fed, but we know and we can trust that Jesus will be there for us. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Now what happens when people get to see us rely heavily on Christ and what he does for us, and we're in trouble, and we're worrying about things, but we insist on trusting in Christ, and then Christ saves us out of it? Those that have seen us may end up worshiping God. They may end up worshiping Jesus because they saw something amazing happen, and then those that were in the boat be like, wow, they worship God because they saw this awesome thing happen. They didn't say they worshiped Peter because he tried to walk on the water. It wasn't about Peter walking on the water. It was about Christ and him being there and saving them, and walking, I don't know how many miles it was, but that was quite the walk across the water. Stupid things go in my brain when I think about this. Was he actually walking up and down the waves, or did he kind of hover atop them? I mean, it's like, how long did it take? I mean, that's a big walk if you're walking up and down the waves, but if you kind of skim the top of them, I don't know. So I don't suppose he got tired either. So, all right, well, he did, but that's a whole nother story. Back up. Okay, so what did they say? Truly you are the Son of God. Recognizing that Christ is God, recognizing he's the one that saves us, recognizing it's because of him that we are saved, and so they are recognizing that truly you are the Son of God. That leads me to my so what? And so it says, so as we see from Peter and the other disciples, we will never fully arrive in our faith. I hate to break it to you, okay? Something will always happen that will challenge it no matter how confident we are. This assures us our continued reliance on Jesus Christ, and that's a good thing, okay? Because how many times has anyone, I know it's happened to me a lot, maybe it doesn't happen to you. You think you got it licked, you trusted in Christ, you followed through, and then something completely different happens, and all of a sudden you don't think that Christ is going to be there to solve it, right? And that's what Peter, he saw all these things, he knew how powerful Jesus was, but then he starts looking around, he's like, wow, this is pretty dangerous, and he sinks. Okay? So we need to recognize that we will never really arrive in our faith because we need to constantly remember that our faith is in Jesus, not in our own ability. And so we need to look to him and continue to look to him. And that's why it's a good thing we never arrive in our faith. Okay? And so with that, I'll move on to my point to ponder. It says, when was the last time your faith was tested, and how did the test surprise you? God finds neat and interesting ways to test your faith. Trust me. I've been around the block a few times, okay? You think you get there and you realize you don't. And it's not like you think you've arrived as a Christian, but you think you've arrived at trusting Jesus. I can trust Jesus. He's taken me out of so many things. I can trust Jesus. And Jesus is kind of like, oh, this is going to happen and that. And you still believe that? You know, we got to constantly reassure ourselves that Christ will be there immediately when we need to be immediately saved. And then for next week, finalize memorizing 1 Peter 1, 22 and 23. And then read Matthew chapter 16. There's a lot of good stuff in Matthew chapter 16. So go ahead and read that. And so with that, this is one of those ones that I didn't come down slowly. It's like just kind of, boom, it's over.